So this is
Yeah.
Max Depth Podcast. I've been doing this since 2019, off and on, interested in philosophy, deep ideas, everything. And you seem just like the perfect person to interview. Wide ranging interests, and really a deep thinker and writer. So that's exactly why I wanted you to have you on. So first of all, thanks for doing that.
No, thank
Maybe you
you.
could just start by introducing yourself, telling anyone that's listening, who you are and, the things you're interested in, the questions you're trying to uncover or help to uncover, and kind of how you came to find those questions important and meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you're what we're going to be discussing further. I think you're very much triggering the hysteric neurotic in me in sort of the psychoanalytic sense because for some reason I find the praise absolutely disgusting in the best way possible. It's something I think all philosophers struggle with is the acceptance that our ideas have any meaning or substance. So I very much appreciate being invited to the podcast because it's honestly. It's just great fun to number one reconnect with someone who went to such a great school, and number two to see that philosophy is expanding in sorts of all areas of interest. It's going to be one of your more unusual podcasts, that's for sure because we're diving into some of the things
Let's do
that
it.
are a bit obscure. It's gonna go over an hour, I'm certain.
Let's go. Let's go too.
Yeah.
I got
So.
time.
About me, my name is Dragan. I'm Romanian German. I've sort of, I moved a lot, but at Georgetown, where I sort of, concretized my desire for academia. I came in originally as an athlete, and then I left very, very, very quickly. I have only one person to thank for getting me into philosophy, and that is, well, two people. Number one is Professor Rizzuto in the English department, who was the one who introduced us to modernism and Lacan. And since then, I've been in love with postmodern theory, all thanks to her, and just the amazing faculty and staff at Georgetown who sort of inspire people like you and I to sort of reach beyond what we think that we enjoy, what we think that we like, to sort of step outside the bounds of regular inquiry. Sure, Econ 101 is fun, but when you start talking and engaging with deeper ideas, especially with people who know what they're talking about, it gets very, very exciting. And that's what sort of, tickles my academic brain in a very good way. I did political economics and philosophy, but most of the learning I have done has been outside of class. Uh, I very much engage with critical theory, Frankfurt School onwards, and continental philosophy. I come from a lineage of German idealism, and what, in some sense, I'm a Marxist philosopher, in the sense that I, ascribe to the post-Hegelian view of philosophy inscribed by Marx, and through Marxist analysis, we here at my institute as well we look at critique, and namely we look how Marxists can shape and change ideas in a materialist sense. I'm in London now. I'm going to my PhD next year in the philosophy department. Um, Undecided yet, but it's looking like it's going to be UCL for now. I founded an institute here in London for psychoanalysis and philosophy, and we've been growing very, very quickly. We have over 500 attendees now for seminars.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's been very, very nice to see how quickly something grows. And in fact, I was discussing with another amazing academic, Raphael Holmberg, yesterday, how the UCL psychoanalysis department is quoting us as rivals now. So it's fun to stir up a little bit of a friendly competition in the psychoanalytic and philosophy departments here in London. It's been great.
That's great. So I guess what's your hope with that society?
Um, the thing with societies in London and psychoanalysis in general is that, if I can put it bluntly, they're going to shit everywhere. They've become the pseudo-academic spaces is the best way I could possibly say. They're becoming empty and vapid. They're sort of becoming popularity contests almost, and academia in and of itself is facing a cold war. I think, not to discuss US politics too much, but academic funding, especially for the humanities, is dying in the Western world, and now societies are ascribing to sort of very orthodox rules. Everything is based on popularity and funding, and they don't really become spaces for discussion or critique. Psychoanalysis in the UK has become absolutely redundant. They're trying to become purely practice-based. They're heading down a very the post-Freudian path that does not really relate to some of the major psychoanalytic lessons that we should be taking away. They're delving more in towards like cognitive behavioral therapy or even behavioralism as a science rather than facing the original questions of the unconscious, the drives, repetition that people like Freud and Lacan aimed to reconstruct. So with this philosophy and psychoanalysis society, excuse me, we're trying to marry the two fields to make it not just purely philosophy and not purely psychoanalysis, because the question of philosophy and critique in nowadays always assumes the position and the positionality of the subject is a very Hegelian, like Hegelian genealogical way of thinking. Like it's all about how the subject organizes reality, right? And political critique always has some sort of form. We try to critique politics because we somehow want the world to be a better place, right? Ultimately, that's the goals and dreams of a subject being in the world in Heideggerian like design sense. The entire purpose of becoming of the subject is to try to make his or like you say, try to live the good life, right? And that's one of the questions that philosophy and critical theory tends to ask is like, how do we question the systems that we in? How do we properly look at forms of domination? How do we properly assess how power is being exploited in societies? How do we look at, for example, how heterodox structures might come and overtake orthodox structures? Why can capitalism not die? You know, there's a famous quote by Frederick Jameson that said that the end of the world is easier to imagine than the end of capitalism, right? There's a sense of we live in these really rigid structured systems. It's easier to imagine an atomic war or solar flares than it is to imagine the end of capitalism because we find ourselves rooted in these systems all the time. And philosophy, I think analytic philosophy and a lot of critical theory really tries to address, how do we change the basic material outcome of the world? How do we just not stay just in pure theory, and how do we go and actually make social change? And the reason why psychoanalysis is important is because it allows us to address the unspoken. It allows us to address the matter of the unconscious and the drive and the fact that behind political development, behind social change, there exist desires, right? We're all human beings. We're all human beings of desire. And it's up until that we address why we have the certain desires that we do have and the drives that we'll never be able to fully get a full picture of what social change will look like. So this, we have to sort of look at we have to look at it in the dialectical sense, in the sense that we are trying to boost theory and to sort of look past the scope of well, boost theory and look past the scope of theory in and of itself. Which was, the founders of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and Adorno. Those were the things that they were trying to push forward. But ultimately, even the Frankfurt School did not live up to its goals and dreams that they wanted to ascribe. So that's why I think the marriage of psychoanalysis and philosophy is something that's absolutely critical, not just something that is a cool up and coming thing now, because psychoanalysis is becoming very it's kind of like the golden goose now of the philosophical movement. Everybody wants to be in psychoanalysis, but nobody really understands what psychoanalysis is in the first place.
I do think there is an emergence, especially like online and podcasts. I don't know if it was facilitated by Jordan Peterson or Slavoj, but this fascination with Jung and Freud and Nietzsche and some of those psychologists, I do see as immensely popular right now. And I wonder what that is in response to.
Well, it's clear that the way in which we have progressed in society, we see we see something called overhealing, right? We tend to desire to have explanations for everything. Um, that's in large part driven by the development of technology, and there's a great book by Martin Heidegger called Off the Beaten Track, where he talks about how he sort of culminates all of his ideas that he develops in being being in time, yeah, not time and being the original first work. Um, Basically, he refers to this term called Gestell, and Gestell for the subject is this idea that we no longer have a sort of relationship with the natural world that is non-alienated, right? Like the human being itself is essentially always alienated from its environment. There's always a sort of difference, like between what the subject experiences and the natural world outside, and that causes a lot of philosophers argue that that causes a great deal of alienation, right? It causes a lot of fear and angoisse, a lot of insecurity. And the development of technology for Heidegger is this idea that we are trying to better understand and better sort of fit in to this natural world system that we encounter. And a lot of that has to do with prediction. It has to do with being able to dominate natural forces. It has to being able to have sort of a grasp over what is not really controllable, kind of like the horses at the end of Plato's Phaedrus, right? Like you have the horse of reason, the horse of impulse, and the entire process of human development is to try to control these horses that they don't really have a good grasp over. And I think we're leading now to a culmination where the idea of unknown is becoming more and more scary. And I think that is, precisely what is causing people to sort of look to look to psychology now as a really growing field. People want to more and more understand their minds is something that I think is the project of modern man, because precisely because we feel this alienation so much more. The more technology is developed, the faster we have access to everything in almost instantaneous seconds. If I'm worried about a question, I can look it up on my phone. If I'm anxious about tomorrow, I can text my friend and see where we're meeting, all these things. And I think that this disgusting desire for certainty is precisely what fuels so many of like the sort of the mental responses that we have. We're no longer able to sit with uncertainty. And I think that's what's causing a lot of drives towards self-understanding and self-healing and understanding why we have these certain pathological responses. You know, we are shifting to a society who's recognizing that we have certain traits that need to be understood, and these traits can no longer be understood on a conscious level. And I think that this is the obsession and the return to Lacan, or the return to Freud, is this idea that in order to sort of understand ourselves, we have to understand what we cannot understand, if that makes sense. And I
It
think
reminds me
that's
of one of it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Blaise Pascal, which is all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit in a room alone with himself.
Yeah, well, when is the last time? I don't know. I can't even remember the last time I've sat for 10 minutes. It's actually a practice that I've been trying to do now. I've noticed that I tend to feel better when I let the unconscious speak in a certain sense. And I think that the technology has allowed us to repress things very well. You're constantly distracted. You're constantly
And to escape our own boredom or thoughts or negative feelings or awkwardness, you can turn to your phone in
yeah,
any situation.
yeah. That is the main thing. It's just sort of it becomes like a neurotic obsession with the phone, almost like a compulsion. And I think I've noticed that the you tend to avoid the unnecessary conversation between yourself as ego and yourself as what is unexpressible. And for some, this may be only possible in analysis or, through psychoanalytic therapy. But I think there is a process of self becoming that involves sitting still. I think that's something that is absolutely critical in self-understanding. I've noticed that most of the big decisions in my life always happen on planes. The plane is always a place where, I'm disconnected from reality for a few hours, and sort of the underlying important thoughts that need to be addressed bubble up to the surface. And that's a practice that everyone needs to apply, in my opinion, because we are sort of we're pulled towards this directionless sense of information. Everything is flat. Even time itself has become flat. You know,
What does that mean?
uh, there's this fantastic book by Byung-Chul Han called The Scent of Time, and
The
I
scent?
think The Scent of Time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He it's called The Scent of Time because he's referring to Marcel Proust's that I forgot the name of the book, the very long book now that
Hmm.
won 7 volumes,
Yeah.
in which he smells a Madeleine and he's brought back to his childhood and all these things. But we one of the main things that I research now is temporality, and that is one of the main things that I'm very much interested in, and it's one of the first things that Lacan addressed in his writings in 1956. It's the idea that our relationship with time itself is changing. Um, uh, Zygmunt Bauman, he talked about man as a pilgrim, modern man as a pilgrim, but pilgrimage involves that we're heading towards somewhere, right? And one thing that we are, really trying to differentiate ourselves in modern society is that in primordial time, we had a very we had a divine relationship with the world. The world was dominated by gods, right? If you look at ancient Near Eastern times, everything was pointing towards eschatology. So man lived in everlasting present. The Enlightenment is the moment in history in which the truth of the subject doesn't really come from outside anymore. It's no longer a theological relationship or relationship to God or even like the pagan gods of nature or everything. The Enlightenment is when the subject becomes the object of reason, right? Like we are a self-understanding subject who is able to make for ourselves our own conception of the world, and we are free and we must use reason to liberate ourselves. And putting humanity at the center is progressed us what Han argues from theological time to historical time. The Enlightenment has this goal of, attaining a finality of reason which liberates everyone. It became historical time. We're directed towards something. And the problem with that is it's very well and good when the speed of these direction travel is able to be synthesized by the human. And we see that with scientific development, right? We're always trying to move towards the next thing. But information and this overload of information flattens time. And time no longer has a direction or a sense. There's no more progression towards an eschatological end or towards this idea of like a teleological end of, okay, the final progress of human reason. No, the modern age is not really directed towards anything. And Han, what we just talked about, says that we have lost our ability as a society to linger. And lingering is one of the most important things in the sort of experience of being human, because lingering allows you to experience time for what it is, not flattened by information. And that's like one of the main things I'm also looking at now in my essays, in things that I'm looking at.
That idea of, what is the end, like the teleological lens. Does that relate at all to Nietzsche's idea of the death of God and having almost a vacuum of prescribed meaning and ends in which we are all either underladen or all working towards?
I have a very unique view on Nietzsche's Death of God, and I wrote about this in one of my papers. Um, I approach Nietzsche's Death of God from a very like psychoanalytic framework, sort of looking at it. It's not per se that like there needs to be an other for Nietzsche to explain the degradation of society. I looked at it in the sense that Germany at that time when he was writing was progressing into what he would call his decadence, into sort of the degradation of society, the degradation of morals, blah, blah, blah. But there has to be an object that, in Lacanian theory, it's the idea that the relationship between subject object is always mediated by an other. And we can get into that, and I can explain more about how that works. But my argument for Nietzsche was that he has to create this sort of responsibility of an other, of society killing God, for example, in order to mediate the fact that he's very much uncomfortable with the development of society at that point, even though the development of society at that point might have nothing to do with the death of God in and of itself.
Because in that
And
article, you described him as a romantic.
yeah, Nietzsche is the ultimate romantic, you know. He is the ultimate, he's the ultimate returner to nature, right? Like he calls himself the ultimate Dionysian. He wants to return to this era of, you know, Greek mythology and sort of the poets having more power in society than the people and all these things. Like he wants to return to a place where we don't rationally quench the passions and we don't sort of that's why he talks about theology in itself. Like theology is the most pitiful of all philosophies because we are inherently always say like I'm such a sinner, I should be beaten, and you know I deserve to starve myself around Lent time in order to sort of you know reconcile this inner guilt that I feel, blah blah blah. So for me, Nietzsche is the ultimate romantic because he wants to unbridle all of these things.
What do you think about the idea of the philosopher king? I don't know who first put that forward. I
Plato,
think,
Plato.
yeah, Plato, and how far we've kind of moved away from that system, and that a reality TV star is president, etc. Just that idea, really, more than the actual example. Is there a way to regain that? And I just love that idea.
Mm.
And also the idea, like going back to George Washington, like first principles of the United States, like um, leaders taking responsibility, that you're a servant of the people, and even farther back that you're like a servant of God, I guess. I love that idea, and I wonder if you have views on how we relate to that now, and its development.
One of the interesting things that comes to mind here is this idea that like I like to think about is this idea of an achievement society. You know, everything has become metricized. We want to be the healthiest, fittest versions of ourselves, and in that sense, it's not like it's innate goal, but it's a sort of societal goal. Like you see all these fitness influencers, like you're talking about these reality TV show stars. It's we have developed this idea of an achievement subject. Um, we have become very trapped in the cycle of self-exploitation. That's, I think, is the main thing. And the reason, one of the big things that I'm writing now with one of my friends is the idea that we as humans have lost the ability for a revolution. We have lost the ability to sort of, it sounds bad, but we've lost the ability to sort of organize revolution. And I was actually chatting with this with a friend of mine, and he was saying, you know, if Kennedy was leaked in the Epstein files, I think he would have had 2 days and 2 days left in the office before he was killed or taken out. You know what I mean? I mean, Bill Clinton got sent out of office for consensual sexual relationships. Now we see that everything is allowed, you know, everything is permitted nowadays. You know, we've become a society of permission. Nothing really has value anymore because it's fleeting. Today, Trump is in the Epstein files. Tomorrow, there's a war with Iran. You know, there's this overload of information in society, and we are so distracted by vain and unnecessary things like being the fittest version of ourselves. We're constantly in these cycles of exploitation, you know, and then
Running on a faster and faster treadmill where we can't keep up, and we're tripping over ourselves just to keep up with
yeah.
information.
It's the idea that we've become so conditioned to the idea that we have to sort of become a project rather than a human being that we're so fucking uninterested in anything else that goes on outside life. And you know, we have this disgusting fetish of like trying to, you know, it's almost perverse and masochistic in the sense of like, okay, you know, we have to, you know, become the best version of ourselves, exploit ourselves. But at the same time, when it becomes to real world material issues, we get away with it by resharing something on Instagram and being like, okay, I've posited my contribution to the conflict in Gaza. I've reposted a story. But we always return back to this idea that we are subjects to projection, right? Like we have this idealization of the self, And it doesn't matter if it's political identification, I'm pro LGBTQ rights, whatever, or if it's because of moral posturing, the atrocities in Gaza, whatever, aesthetic autocuration, the oat matcha latte at Blank Street after a Pilates session, or self-entrepreneurship, and so on and so on and so on. And you know, these imperatives to project an idealization intensifies competition at the level of identity itself. And the thing is, the biggest irony of all of this is that we're not competing in some sort of game to become the best version of ourselves. We are competing against others on the same level to realize ourselves. It becomes a level of competition, and competition distracts us from any necessary critique that we need to have as a society. We're so obsessed about what the other is doing and what the other is achieving, and why we are not limiting, why we're limiting ourselves to the self-limiting beliefs that we have as human beings of, maybe I cannot get my body fat percentage down to 8%, but it limits our idea of critique or discussion in general. And it's almost like this race to the bottom in capitalism for labor, for example, or for prices. If you read things through a Marxist lens, things become very clear. And we conform to this persistent demand to perform and sustain for the other's gaze. For Lacan, for example, the subject is always performing for the other. Like we don't do things for ourselves. We do things for the other, and the other is a symbolic realm of language, rules, laws. The best example I can give is Freud's description of the primordial father. And there's a story about, imagine an early society where the father of the village or the clan is, the leading male sexually, and he has all the women, and, he's the only one allowed to reproduce with the women, and he's the only one allowed for sexual relationships and everything else. And the sons of the village, they're pissed off because they cannot have sex with any of the women. And so in frustration, they kill their father. And Freud's saying that, in some way, society, the father, this domineering father figure who prevents and castrates the sons from being able to have sexual relationships with any of the other people, the rule of the father is adopted by society after they kill the father. So it's like the son's guilt of killing the father is somehow readopted into society, and it's taken as rule of law, which is why we have, that's why he argues for Christian self-preservation, anti-adultery, all these things, is this idea that we have some sort of primordial guilt that we try to sort of step away from. And when I say ideal, I don't mean it in the sense of like achieving the highest good. I'm saying simply that we are trying to figure out these idealisms and like try to become a projection subject, rather than a subject who just experiences the world in a such. So we're constantly trying to construct ourselves in a certain manner, and it's this obsession with this self-construction and this innate guilt that we have inherited from somewhere, from the symbolic order that we live in, that causes us precisely to be trapped in these cycles of self-exploitation.
It's an interesting framing, self-exploitation, because
That's what it is.
it's commonly perceived as self-improvement.
Yeah, exactly.
And that, I mean, what Jung would have said, like an overemphasis on the persona, which
Hey,
is,
hey, hey. And
one
this
piece of a much broader aspect of yourself.
precisely why it becomes self-exploitation is because of the emergence of the fact that we have to project this exploitation somewhere. In a Marxist sense, there is production extracted from self-improvement. What is this production? The Instagram story, the aesthetic. There is some value X of production that is extracted from the self-exploitation. It's like squeezing orange juice,
So
not to turn.
we're exploiting our true self for the improvement of the projected self.
Yes, precisely.
Hmm.
Because it becomes almost it's this collapse of the master-slave relationship in Hegel. Uh, it's the idea that it's precisely this idea in Hegel that there is let's say again, philosophers love going back to primordial man, and it's a metaphorical primordial man. This person didn't actually exist wandering around the Sahara. When we
Sure.
talk about primordial man, he always talks about the encounter. And the encounter, let's say it's you and I, and we're somewhere and we're walking in a forest and we encounter each other. The entire purpose of being human, for Hegel and for Lacan, is the fact that we can never identify ourselves as human purely by our own existence. We only see ourselves through the other. That's a big thing, and I would actually really like to talk about the imaginary later. Remind me to talk about the imaginary. But the main point here is that we have desires for two things. We desire the recognition of others, and of course, in a libidinal sense, we desire others as well. But we desire and we initially desire recognition from the other. And this is precisely what for Hegel is his master-slave dialectic, is that in any binary relationship, let's say you and I, there is a struggle for power, right? And in this struggle for power, there is the master who overcomes the fear of death and becomes the master, and there is a slave who sacrifices his freedom in order to prevent death or to experience like safety, let's say. And there becomes a dialectical relationship between master and slave. What's important is that by remembering that we have to identify ourselves with the other, we essentially the master is more dependent on the slave than the slave is on the master, because it's only the position of the slave that allows the master to identify himself as such. And in the same sense, we do the same thing with ourselves. We position our psyche in a sense of master-slave dialectic, right? We have this collapse of the master-slave dialectic, and we're no longer society no longer trying to dominate over other forms. Of course, this is bullshit. There are forms of domination in society. I'm just talking about the fact that we sort of have collapsed the subject master idea into singularity, right? Where the dialectic permeates directly through the individual and less through a substantive class conflict. Although many people are going to disagree, and I also disagree with my own point, so I'm full of shit. But the idea of a class consciousness of war is being sort of collapsed, at least in the West, is what I'm trying to say.
Do you want to talk now about the imaginary? Because I'd love to
Yeah,
hear
yeah, yeah.
what that is.
So the imaginary was one of Lacan's first developments. He talks about it in his 54 paper for his papers on technique. And I think this is one of the most interesting concepts of psychoanalysis and the most interesting concepts on how humans recognize the fact that they have subjectivity. Um, Lacan was, of course, a clinical psychoanalyst first, and a lot of his research was with child development at the beginning. And he develops this concept of the mirror stage, le stage de miroir. Um, and very simply, around the age of 6 to 18 months, a child is placed in front of a mirror, usually by the parents. And in this process, the child is guided through the help of the parents to recognize that his or her reflection in the mirror is in fact them. So imagine a small child with their parents like, look, this is you, like this is who you are. But then something happens for Lacan. And this is something that will carry on. This is it's called the stage because it's not really a specific moment in time, but it's a continual process of self-becoming. When the child recognizes itself in the mirror as qua child, something very important happens. It's we are introduced to the concept of lack, to difference, of a misrecognition. So the entire existence of being human as a child or as an infant or toddler is very complicated, right? You're completely, number one, you're completely dependent on your parents. You for food, for water, for love, for care. Number two, your internal world is very complicated. Humans are very complicated internal worlds. We have a variety of emotions. We have a ton of bodily discomforts. Our back hurts tomorrow. We have a migraine the next day. The internal environment of the human is very superfluous. And the image that we see in the mirror, or that the infant sees and recognizes in the mirror, is this sort of ideal I, right? It's not the actual, the mirror never captures the actual existence of being, right? It never captures the essence of what it means to be. Child psychology actually says, and also very, very interestingly, schizophrenics sometimes are immune to the mirror stage precisely because they experience their body as parts. But for children, especially the body is seen in parts. Like you have the fecal system, the urinary system, the digestive system for hunger. They experience everything in parts. Their coordination is terrible. They can't even lift a spoon. Anyway, there's this huge disjunction between what I am and what I see. And for Lacan and for a lot of psychoanalysts who continue the Lacanian tradition, there becomes a misrecognition. The I that I see in the mirror is not the I that I actually experience. And this introduces the grain of what is desire. And the imaginary does not function purely on this mirror-based level, right? Like another great example would be the child begins to learn that the mother is not only desired by the child, it's also desired by father, for example. The mother cannot always give her attention to the child, she will also divide her attention to somebody else. So it's this idea that we only recognize ourselves through the gaze of another. Um, so that's why it's very fascinating in child psychology. Children sometimes fall when they see children sometimes cry when they see other children fall over. And that's a very confusing phenomenon because well, what does that even imply about the child as being? It's this idea that the entire existence of what we believe we are is never what we actually are, but it's always mediated through some tertiary or like some secondary sort of function. And that's the imaginary. And the best example is Lacan was working in a Belgian child facility, and back then, if you had autism or if you had any sort of mental disorders, you'd be put in a facility for children. It was awful, but essentially, there was a case of the autistic girl who was told to wash her body, and she only washed the front side of her body and never the back because she never recognized the back qua being in the mirror. She never saw the back in the mirror. And when she was shown the back for the first time, she became entirely distressed, precisely because she only saw herself in the front side of the mirror. So for her, her idea of being is only based on image. That's why it's called the imaginary. We only identify ourselves based on the realm of images, on the realm of what the other sees, not what we see. And for Lacan, this is what drives what he would call objet petit a, which is the fundamental kernel of desire. It's because, again, relating to this idea of self-exploitation, we are always trying to reach that version of the ideal I that we think we should be. And these images are conditioned by society. They're conditioned by what he would bring in and call the symbolic order, right? So the entire idea of Buddhism, of the self as illusion, is something that's taken up in psychoanalysis as well, right? The self isn't really qua self, it's a self constructed by the gaze of others. And until we recognize that our desires and our drives are really brought by this imaginary realm, we're always going to be trapped in, and Lacan's a bit pessimistic, we're always going to be trapped in the cycles of desire. We're never fully attaining what we desire because we always believe that there's some sort of méconnaissance, this gap between who we are and the ideal I that we envision. It's a lot to take
Fair.
in.
No, completely. I mean, I'm wondering what is a healthy relationship? What does a healthy conceptualization of yourself look like?
Impossible.
What do you mean?
Entirely impossible.
What do you mean?
There's no such thing as self-understanding. Like it's this
So the
very
neon sign that I said that says "Teme no se know thyself." That's
no. Honestly, there's no such thing as knowing yourself. The entire idea of the entire language of the idea of knowing oneself comes from the symbolic order, right? Where it's imposed by society. This idea that you have to sort of understand yourself, and it's very interesting. It's not about knowing yourself per se, but it's about reconstructing your history to understand what your drives and impulses and unconscious repetitions are. It's fascinating. And in that sense, maybe it is self-knowledge, but the idea that we have access to this version of our true selves is nonsense. It's pure nonsense. We never have access to a version of our true selves because the idea of a true self is always mediated through some external other. It's never a one-to-one relationship with ourselves. Our relationship with ourselves is always mediated by a symbolic order that tells us that, I mean, the fact that we use language already, number one, language already makes us and castrates us as slaves because we don't own the language that we speak. Language is spoken through the subject. Before a child is born, even prior to your existence, your parents spoke about you. He's going to be a handsome boy like you are right now. He's going to be very successful university. He's going to be living in, well, I don't know where. He's going to be doing this. There already exists a package of language that is spoken about you as a subject before you're even born, and you are born into language. There's this really, really funny example by Jacques Lacan where he talks about the highwayman, and there's this vandal in the street, and he ties a bandana around his head, and he goes to a trucker and he says, "All right, give me your life or your money," you know? And Lacan uses this to say that we don't really have something, we don't have being without meaning, or we don't have meaning without being. They're always together. So what I mean by this is like if the driver or the trucker chooses to give up his life, then he loses all meaning, right? Or like if he dies, then the object of money no longer has any significance because he's dead.
Hmm.
He gives up being what defines his life. Let's say this is a world where you're only defined by money, which is not very far from what our world looks like today.
Hmm.
Uh, if you give up the idea of meaning, if you castrate yourself from the idea of money, you also, in some sense, lose the idea of being, right? Because you give up the meaning of being. So, in that very same sense, the idea of self-knowledge is entirely impossible because being qua self-knowledge is always tied to meaning. And meaning is always mediated by the symbolic order, by languages, rules, law, religion, what society tells us we should do, by guilt, self-castration, all these things. Um, and that's why precisely it is impossible to know the true version of yourselves. You can only approximate it. It's like that function of 1 over x as you approach the origin. You kind of you never reach the core of what it means to be you. You never reach the core of your neurosis. You never reach the core of your pathological nucleus is what Freud called it. It's this idea that like there is some dark energy inside you that one day you're able to unlock Pandora's box and then you're able to see yourself clearly, whatever. No, you're never able to access the unconscious. And the idea of self-knowledge is always impossible because we always operate on the level of unconscious all the time. This idea of self-knowledge is exists only on a conscious, on a cognitive level. But we're always driven to repeat compulsively mistakes from the past, for example, is something that Freud was. It's called repetition automatism, and that's something that I've experienced in my life as well. I seem, especially in personal relationships, for example, to always make the same mistakes. Um, and somehow it's this strange force, what Lacan would always call the unconscious drive, that brings us to make these same mistakes that we always do. Eh, what the goal of analysis is through language to sort of help the patient reconstruct their narrative of history and understand why they're unconscious or attempt to understand why the unconscious drives them to do certain things that they do. And that is about the closest we're going to ever be able to get of self-knowledge, in my opinion. Depressing, but not
Well, yeah, I mean,
depressing.
I think of it as like circumnavigating. You're kind of like,
Yes.
going around the thing.
Yeah, no, the unconscious is like a black hole, like you can never see the unconscious, you can never reconstruct it in this whole sense. You can only orbit around the unconscious and like, same way in space, you can never see a black hole. You can only detect black holes because they distort light around them. In the exact same way, that's the best way that we can
Mm.
access that's the best way we can access the unconscious is the idea that we can never really fully grasp what it is. And Lacan uses this beautiful metaphor from the Greek tragic play of Eurydice and Orpheus, and he's talking about how Orpheus was sent to the underground to discover and to bring Eurydice back. But he was told and warned by the gods that you can never look at her because she's going to disappear. In the same way, as soon as the analyst or gets close to the kernel of the unconscious always transforms and disappears itself. It's like that's why the unconscious itself can only be revealed through mistakes, through slips, through compulsive behaviors, through physical symptoms, for example, because we never get the true idea of what the unconscious is as a physical being.
It reminds me of two things. One was I was learning about Salvador Dali, and he would fall like he would hold a key, like a brass key, heavy, off the side of his bed, and he would like fall asleep. And as you fall
Mm.
asleep, he would let go, and the key would hit the floor, wake him up, and then he would jump up and try to start doing art to try to like sneak up on the unconscious. And the other thing it made me think of was Shakespeare has a line that I have written in my notes. That is something like, there's nothing more confining than the prisons we know we're not in. And
Mm.
it reminded me when you were talking about languages, like basic, you're trapped and you can't get out of it.
Well, yeah, because language is the only thing we really have as humans to sort of transliterate what we can bring for our internal world through the external world, right? It's the only thing that sort of unites human beings as experience, but language never does the full job, you know.
Sure,
We
it's
have
also
words.
an approximation,
Yeah.
lackluster.
Exactly. Languages, first of all, languages, it's never chosen by the subject. We don't choose to speak the language that we do, and to use the words that we do. We're sort of brought into language as a subject, and we are imposed to use it. And number two, actually, a very interesting thing I want to relate with Salvador Dali is a paper that I'm working on right now, is that art is actually a form of amnesia. Art is the idea of like, and Hegel talks about this in his aesthetics. It's the idea that true art requires a forgetting of the self in a certain sense, and that's why that's also another big thing for Hegel. And it's the last person you should ask for an interpretation of their art is the artist, because the artist precisely tries to forget themselves in order to create the art, and that's the last person who should attempt to try to have the art explain something for you. This idea of like interpassivity, you enjoy the art, you have the surplus enjoyment because of the sort of a tertiary figure that you enjoy from, and only you are able to extract a sense of meaning from it. The funniest example about this unconscious thing is is this concept of interpassivity, and sort of this is one of the most fascinating things. Is like if you look at laughing tracks in comedies, for example, or if you watch
Hmm.
Friends or How I Met Your Mother or whatever,
Hmm.
what does a laughing track actually do? Well, the laughing track is number one, of course, supposed to stimulate you to laugh. But in fact, people who watch shows don't laugh at the same time as the laughing track appears. The laughing track is something that is a surplus enjoyment by the viewer. It's called interpassivity. We enjoy through others. We enjoy through the laughter of others. We don't.
Just like the child cries when he sees his friend fall.
Exactly. It's this idea of it's
The
the idea of an
opposite.
arbitrary. We get this thing called jouissance, and an additional we get this additional perverse sort of enjoyment from others. And honestly, I'm a disgusting neurotic in this sense as well, because I buy a lot of books I buy. I fill them in my apartment, but there's a good chance I probably won't finish them in the next year. And I keep buying books. For Christmas, I asked my mom to get me a Daunt Books, it's a library near here, to get me a gift card. Precisely for me, I'm a pervert in the sense I want to buy more books precisely because I sort of get this interpassive enjoyment from having the books in my home. And actually, it's actually in Japan, it's actually a practice of buying books and not reading them, and having them accumulate in your house. And my house now is a fucking library. But I purely do it in the perverse sense that I need to have all these books around me to make myself seem like I am more academic, more intellectual. Oh wow, you have Hegel's aesthetics here, or you have I don't know, you have Lolita. Oh, I love Lolita. It's for it's this surplus enjoyment I get from having others in my space look through my books. Oh wow, you're such a smart guy. You know what I
uh,
mean? That's what I'm saying. Precisely how the unconscious operates is through these compulsive actions that we don't even realize that we do.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's just an interesting framing. And I'm definitely gonna clip the part that you said I'm a pervert.
No, keep that. Please keep that.
Yeah,
Yeah, they need to know I'm a demented pervert for buying all these books. You know?
completely. Yeah. Um, let me see what else I have written down because there was a lot. We touched on a lot of it.
Yeah, we
Um,
did.
well, it's just interesting. Like, I just wonder, like, what because part of the reason why I'm interested in philosophy is like, how can I actually live? What are the frameworks that I can use that are,
I
helpful
might
for
I
me.
might have been the worst guest to invite on this podcast.
Completely, because you're tearing everything down, but then you rebuild it. So that's like why I want to push and see like what what you think are like the positives that you can construct. Like, because I feel like you analyze, and a lot of philosophy like to me is boring because it's so in the weeds, and I'm like, all right, but what am I supposed to do with all that? Like,
Uh-huh.
like all these books, I'm supposed to somehow like embody that. Like where do I go from here with it?
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking about what is the proper conceptualization of the self. That's why I'm interested in Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch, as I understand it, at least, and the death of God is like, all right, well, what kind of value should I have, or how should I come, to know the values that I should care about? How do I get off the treadmill of capitalism and self objectification to live in a way that is, I don't know if the word's authentic or, you know, not self mutilating, maybe would be a good start.
Mhm.
Those are a few of the questions that, you've definitely, we're definitely all on top of. Um, but so
The,
I guess, do you see hope?
the thing with Western methods of thinking, we are so disgustingly afraid of not understanding something. That's sort of the things that I see. Like by the mid 20th century in philosophy, we see the dominance of analytic philosophy, right? Where especially in the English speaking world, you have this bullshit Vienna school, and I'm sorry, early Wittgenstein, who's a moron in my opinion. Early Wittgenstein, no, late Wittgenstein was very smart, but early Wittgenstein said he sold philosophy because now philosophy is only the idea of logical positivism. It's the idea of, no philosophy is possible. The only thing we can do is empiricism, okay, what's observable in science, and logical reasoning. That's the only thing we have, and everything else is completely redundant. And even in a sense, this neo-Marxists, this idea of reducing everything to just material relationships is something that's so disgustingly Western. It's this idea that there's no, the concept of the subject is not important. All we need to do is look at material realities, and maybe if we understand the material realities of the cobalt mines in Congo, then we can liberate the people. Bullshit. This is one of the biggest pitfalls. And they try to ground the subject always in material reality. Everything is purely material. And they try to sort of they try to categorize the subject in terms of what is, but the subject is the subject of becoming, of what is being. It's not just the material reality. And the fact that Marx as well, and this is one of the things that really annoys me with neo-Marxists, is that they refuse to acknowledge that Marx was an idealist materialist. He was sort of saying that yes, okay, we have to flip Hegel upside down. Not everything is just the sense of like through cognitive faculties, understanding yourself. There are material realities, but yes, it's the subject who identifies himself through these material realities, and that's what Lacan refers to later as the imaginary. That's why he says that Marx invented the symptom. But from what we talked about with Heidegger and another amazing writer is Bernard Stiegler, imagine this. He actually went to prison for 14 years or something like that. In prison, becomes pen pals with Jacques Derrida, leaves prison and becomes one of the most prominent French philosophers of all time. So that's a really cool story if you want to read about
It's
Bernard
a cool
Stiegler.
life.
Very interesting. Yeah. So we try to
14
have,
years would be a little bit long for me, maybe 4 months, and then come out and then be a famous philosopher. But
yeah, you and Maduro together, maybe that'd be. Yeah, but we have this desire, and this is the problem with metaphysics, is that we try to finish metaphysics. We try to complete metaphysics. This is something that Descartes and Leibniz try to do. It's trying to reduce everything, all material reality, all immaterial reality, everything that we know, into this metaphysical totalization of a. They call it a mathesis universalis, trying to turn everything into a math, right? And essentially what we have to recognize is that since we are human, since we are alienated, and since we are born of lack, like we talked about in the imaginary stage, we desire this totalization. We desire to have access to everything, everywhere, all at once. And this term desire is really crucial because once we recognize, and I think this is where we're going to get slightly more positive and less depressing in our approach, but once we recognize that the idea of desire and drive is entirely constitutive of human experience, the limits of purely analytic or purely materialist frameworks finally become clear. We cannot understand what the subject is, and this applies to political critique, to economic critique, to sort of a social liberation, without understanding the fact that there are unconscious drives and symbolic structures, the dynamics of desire that shape all thought and action. We should use psychoanalysis and philosophy together. And I think that is a positive future for the world because philosophy, psychoanalysis is the only method in which we recognize that there's the unconscious faculties are just as important as conscious faculties. While we may never be able to understand them fully, we have to recognize that it's constitutive of human experience. And I've noticed things in my own life changing purely based on the idea that I'm recognizing that I have certain unconscious drives that I'm able to sort of, through self-understanding, I'm such a hypocrite. Through self-understanding, I'm able to narrativize my life in a way that makes sense for unconscious drives, has completely changed the way I see things. And it is a process of self-awareness and the fact that you catch yourself doing certain things. And that's a really funny thing, is that the unconscious is kind of like a cold, you know? You catch a cold, you don't take it from somebody else, or you don't try to get one. You always get sick at the moment in which you don't wish to get sick before an exam, before a flight, something. So the unconscious is a bit like a sickness or a cold. You sort of catch it, but you never fully have it in that sort of sense.
Hmm.
And once you catch yourself rooted in your unconscious repetitions, that's where transformation is possible.
Hmm.
That's what the positive outcome can be.
And one thing you said earlier was like, or this idea of thinking of yourself as a project. You said, you don't like that conceptualization because it's, you are not the project. It's a projection, not to confuse project and projection.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
projection that you're, improving, and it's not yourself. But if you think of, yourself not in the view of not solely as the persona, if it's possible, which I don't know if you agree if it is or
Yeah,
not.
no, 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 no. Of
Um,
course, of course.
if
That's
you
the whole point. The whole point of psychoanalysis is to recognize that your drives are not just your drives personally, but the drives of a symbolic order that tell you what to drive towards.
say that part again, you're part of it.
Like
So what is the symbolic order?
the symbolic order is, Lacan refers to three registers. We talked about the imaginary,
Hmm.
but there's two more for Lacan. And for Lacan, one of them is the symbolic. And basically, do you know what the Borromean knot is? It's kind of
No.
the three circles that are like it's like a Venn diagram with three circles essentially.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
the ropes intersect each other and you cannot be apart from them.
Hmm.
And essentially the symbolic order is while you have the imaginary sphere, the symbolic order, the best way to think about it is language, right? Like language is the order in which we are able to sort of communicate and conceptualize ourselves. We are born in a symbolic order with rules, laws, religious practices, telling us what is sexual deviance or no, homosexuality is bad, all of these things. We are born into a symbolic order that shapes us. That's what Lacan refers to by the symbolic order.
Hmm.
And then
And
the third one's the real. And this is the most complicated of all of them because the real is that which cannot be captured by language itself. The real is something that we can encounter, and the best, like, I don't know, let's use colloquial language. The best way the real can be described is as this traumatic event, let's say. Um, it's this idea of like the black hole. You can never really some people you can encounter the real, but you can never fully express what the real is.
mhm.
Yeah.
So if you can, so because that reminds me of the first few words of the Tao Te Ching, which is, again, talks back to the limitations of language. is like the eternal Tao, and Tao is like the, I guess, underlying essence of the, the true, the real. From my understanding, you can never, say it exactly. You can never express it exactly. And it's always kind of, I guess a thing you're working towards, or a thing you're trying to live in harmony with, in an Eastern sense. And that's like, think of like how to live in this framework as like an unfinished project. I don't mind that framing, as long as you're okay with this distance between where you are and your desires and where you want to be. And that you can since you can't get rid of your desires, that's a long debate in philosophy, that you can at least have some, you can, put a wet cloth over them and a little bit, punch out the flames slightly, with being like, these are things that are never going to go away. This is like an inherent part of being a part of being human, that brings some acceptance. A similar thing, like with suffering, that I think about, like, like people are trying to eliminate suffering. But if you interpret suffering as just a prerequisite, a thing that's built in to the system, a thing you can't give away with, can't do away with, then you frame it in a completely different light. Then it's not about eliminating suffering. It's about, you can judge yourself on how you react to suffering. There are these pre-built-in things to the system which we live in and which we are, that you can't do away with. And,
Mhm.
that can kind of,
Yeah,
serve how you can live.
exactly. This goes back to our original conversation on capitalism, right? Like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is with capitalism. We're inherently like embedded in these capitalist structures that we can never even think of something possibly outside of capitalism. Like we cannot possibly conceptualize an outside of capitalism as it is now in this stage. Uh, we're capitalism somehow born before the conscious for us. We're everything is related in capitalist relationships. And that's one of the things is once you recognize it, then you're able to form accurate critiques on it. And that's the entire point of ideology critique, and at least in this book. When I'm going to grab it really quickly.
Yeah.
I want to read an excerpt from this book called Mapping Ideology by the introduction by Slavoj Žižek.
Hmm.
It's a very good, it's a very good point. This idea that nobody seriously considers possible alternatives to capitalism any longer, whereas popular imagination is persecuted by the visions of forthcoming breakdown of nature. He's talking about ecological crises here, of the stoppage of all life on Earth. It seems easier to imagine the end of the world than a far more modest change in the mode of production, as if liberal capitalism is the real that will somehow survive even under conditions of a global existence of ideology, even in a global ecological catastrophe. One can thus categorically assert the existence of ideology qua generative matrix that regulates the relationship between the visible and non-visible, between imaginable and non-imaginable, as well as the changes in the relationship. Essentially, what he's trying to say is that ideology and capitalism as ideology always operates on before conscious belief. So capitalism sort of functions as the real. And he's saying that in order, this idea that there was this philosophy like idea and by Michel Foucault where he talks about that, like all forms of ideology are essentially forms of disclosure or power relationships. Well, no, what Zizek's trying to imply is that you have to reread ideology through this Marxist Lacanian genealogy, and you have to sort of, talks about how the fact that like yeah, there's also this very important thing is like the way that we critique ideology, we also have to talk about our own perverse limitations in that sense. And he turns to sexuality, for example. Zizek, and he talks about like, there's a lot of criticism now that, there's virtual sex, cyber sex. You put on this cool glove and you have someone, stimulating your genital organs somehow with a VR headset somewhere. And oh, there's this very strange deviation from this idea that like that we have to expose the myth of real sex in the first place. Lacan says that like so the idea of real sex, we believe that there was some sort of pure origin of sexuality before it's corrupted. In the same way, we think that now ideology, like there exists some pure version of ideology or this pure version of a world that we can get to before it is corrupted by ideology. Well, no, Lacan says, and we're not going to get into this because it's going to be a nightmare, but Lacan says that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, which then there is, don't worry about it. It's Lacan's very complicated in terms of sexuality, but what he's trying to imply is that we always think that there's this radical break that we can somehow attend to in which we efface the past and we're like, okay, we fix this perverted, broken society that we are, or we somehow move towards something better or like a rupture, or we use that. I think the most important thing and the positive takeaway from this is that if we accept the fact in the same way that there is no sexual relationship, that there is no pure form of pre-ideological structures, then only then we can critique it properly. And I think that's the positive takeaway from psychoanalysis and the critique of ideology.
Mhm. We had like a joke in our house senior year. It was Zizek said like, tell me, why do you love me? And if you can tell him, then you don't actually love him,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
which I thought was funny. That's kind of all I know about the guy, honestly.
Zizek, right now we're in a bit of a disagreement over the topic of reality.
Oh,
Sort
good.
of.
Subtle concept.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Zizek, currently there's a big argument in the philosophical world, one that I'm a bit involved in right now. Let's say the idea that sort of the idea that reality is incomplete is something that Zizek points, but his ontological argument for the incompleteness of reality is not very well structured, in my opinion, and it's shared by the opinion of a few others in the field of mine. His ontological arguments are sometimes a little bit unstructured, but he's a fantastic thinker, and he's honestly one of the reasons why I got into philosophy in the first place. I his he's fantastic at bringing in a bunch of different examples about, to explain things. Like I'm literally reading Looking Awry now by Slavoj Žižek, and it's a horrible, horrible book, but it's fantastic at the same time. And I think he's very good at revealing these inversals, or like these sort of flips that Lacan talks about. And honestly, like his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, is absolutely fascinating. I could talk about that for 2, 3, 4 hours. And if you want to get more into ideology, we can always do another talk on it because I have a lot more to say for ideology. But I think that for the purpose of this and the idea of the self, I think we covered a lot today. And I think that we sort of destroyed philosophy in the process of doing it, which is always nice.
Would you recommend someone to go down the same kind of rabbit hole that you've gone down?
No, for your sanity, no. Live on the level of the imaginary, believe change is possible, believe that you have a self, and go be much happier than I am. That's the advice I would give to everyone.
Because that's the most popular video I ever put out on YouTube was, why geniuses go insane. Little clickbaity title. But exactly like this idea of, uh, you know, going down to a level where other people aren't operating on and feeling, I think, misunderstood or,
Yes,
not
I
knowing.
feel the more I read, the more I feel alienated from the entire world. And I actually had a discussion about this, and it's like, it's funny because most philosophers are actually very insane in the end. So I think I'm going to keep choosing to believe in this sort of idea that I can change myself for the better, and suppress the information that I'm learning about the unconscious until I live, and it'll be really restricted to only my writings. But no, philosophy is a difficult subject to breach. It changes your worldview in so many ways, and it makes things very difficult to understand. And honestly, this line of ideology critique can be very depressing at times because you see how rooted we are in sort of our drives and the things that we cannot really discuss. So, but there's some nice philosophy out there as well. My favorite quote from Nietzsche is also, this is the funniest thing, is that sometimes even the most pessimistic philosophers are the biggest hypocrites. My favorite line of all time, Schopenhauer was the biggest pessimist in philosophy. He wrote The World as Will and Representation, and he kind of talks about this idea that there exists this thing called the Wille, and the Wille is like what sort of organizes human experience and it causes chaos and it's like this force that is overwhelming. And Nietzsche actually wrote a response saying that, Schopenhauer is full of shit. He's not really a pessimist because he plays the flute every night. So it's like, yeah. Schopenhauer said that, for example, music is the purest form of escape from the Wille, for example. And of course, Nietzsche has something to say about that because, the pessimist playing the flute every night doesn't seem very pessimistic. So,
Mhm. Yeah,
yeah,
what did Schopenhauer say? The only two escapes from suffering are asceticism or art.
yes, yes.
Yeah, there's no middle way there.
He hasn't tried hard drugs.
Yeah, yeah, we're that's I mean, listen, we can go there. I mean, the senior year I took a class called mysticism and psychedelics, and I've thought this forever. I didn't need the class for it. About the benefits of ego dissolution, and that a lot of religious experiences are, based around a ego dissolving experience. And one of the things you said earlier was, you can't, when you're talking about artists, you can't create great art if, you're in the picture, something like that. And I'm thinking you can't even live if you're overtly focused on yourself. When I'm, you know, thinking of myself, um, it's only when I'm fully immersed in a conversation like this or immersed in the thing I'm doing and I forget myself that, that's when I feel the best, when I don't feel myself at
Yeah.
all. And I'm just like
Well,
ethereal.
that's
I'm immersed in the thing. I'm atoms in the soup.
yeah. What I've noticed, and I want to say two things on the subject. The more I tend to know that I exist, the worse my mental state becomes. And
Completely, you're your
I,
own neurosis.
yeah, I experienced this in my first few months in London. Moving to a new city is always hard. And well, I'd been in London before, and I had living when I was younger. I didn't really feel socially integrated in my first few months here, honestly. And this is something that's been a common experience with many people, especially because the UK education system, they don't give you a lot of classes or a lot of contact time. I felt that I was in the apartment by myself most of the time, and the weather's getting shit, and it's getting dark outside at 2:30 p.m. And I had noticed that like the more time I spent with myself, the worse I felt. And I think one of the big cures for this ego dissolution is something that is ubiquitous across all religions. It's this idea of forgetting yourself, right? Like even in Christian meditative prayer, you sort of forget about yourself. And although, yes, you do reflect on yourself as a sinner, for example, or in Buddhist meditation practice, you try to focus on your breathing to the fact that you forget yourself. They're both pointed in the same direction. Like Buddhism, for example, in the practice of like Shinto Buddhism, wants you to focus on the smallest thing possible, your breath, right? That is the way to access enlightenment. Christianity, as an example, makes you focus on the highest thing of all time. So you're the idea of a theological God, right? But both things take the focus off the self, whether it be pointed up or pointed down towards the breath.
It's funny you say that because the a form of meditation or visualization that I do is going down the scales of complexity and size into the tissues that make up my body, and then
Mm.
everything I learned in AP Bio, and then what little I know of
Yeah,
chemistry,
yeah.
physics, and math, and
Mhm,
quarks and leptons,
mhm.
etc. Starting there and then regrowing the entire world from that, knowing that the human body is made of 27 trillion cells, and then having the human being in the middle, and then going all the way up to the world, to the city, to the world, to the solar system, to the planets, to
Yes,
the
yes, 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 yes.
etc. And those two framings, I mean, I do like that's a kind of a materialist reinterpretation of Shinto Buddhism and
Yeah,
Christian
yeah.
meditation, as you've said.
No, but precisely, and this is the reason why I'm so disgusting as a person, because I study Lacanian psychoanalysis, but at the same time, I'm quite strong in Orthodox Christianity. I'm Romanian Greek Orthodox. I go to church, and even as a Lacanian, as having all these things, I still need to do these things because I inherently need to do them in order to feel good about myself. You know what I mean? And this is precisely why I'm disgusting as a human being, because I'm studying all of these Lacanian psychoanalytic terms, but at the same time, I'm so rooted in this desire to sort of liberate myself from myself that I continue to practice the very things that I know on some level are superfluous structures constructed by this thing. And this is very funny. I had a conversation with with this amazing. This guy is an absolute genius. You know, like I wish I had 3% of his thinking power. His name's Raphael Holmberg, and he's a good friend of mine here in London. And he's this is fascinating book. I think Slavoj Žižek was one who referred to one of them. But the entire idea of Catholicism, and the fact that we build these beautiful churches are precisely to forget about the idea of maybe God might not exist. You know, so again, it comes back to my own perverse discussing habits with my books. This idea of interpassivity of, sort of I get this surplus enjoyment from the books. I also tend to get a surplus enjoyment from meditative prayer because I feel like in those moments, number one, maybe on some level, I'm also feeling that these meditative prayers are something that's good for me, and everyone's talking about them, and behavioral therapy says that you should do them because you can understand your thoughts better. But at the same time, it also is a great opportunity for me to erase the ego in a certain sense. And it's very important for me to erase the ego because I don't like the ego that currently exists. And there's other forms of escapism, so there's various forms of escapism. And the human being itself is an escapist machine. Whether we turn to art, drugs, alcohol, religion, it's all forms of escapism from ourselves. So
But so what is that? So that's one thing I've been thinking about, like in terms of like distraction or escapism. But like, what are you escaping away from? Like, what is the opposite of escapism? Like, isn't being immersed in the world, and isn't everything escapism? I don't know what there is beside
mm.
the escape.
Precisely, we're escapist machines. I think there's a difference between sort of being a contributing member of society and functioning, and being in the world. At the same time, there is a this sort of Todesfurcht, like what Freud talks about, like the death drive, right? Like there's certain escapist habits that are, people who jump from airplanes with little parachutes, and people who binge drink on weekends so hard that they get germs. Uh, there's different various forms of escapism that are taken about, and again, this has to do with our unconscious. Why are we driven towards these escapist behaviors? Of course, there's varying levels of escapism, but I think it's ultimately necessary for the human being, the artist, the musician to forget themselves, and that's how we can fully embrace the totality of being is precisely by trying to be a non-being.
So, I don't know whether to think of this question as if you had the world stage and everyone was listening to you, what would you say? Or, like a deathbed thought, like what would you want to leave people with? I don't know if either of those kind of questions stir up anything inside of you that, you think, everyone should hear.
On a deathbed thought.
Or, something, that you're like, I don't know what philosopher would say, their central thesis, I think, I guess could Nietzsche say, think through
All right,
your
I
values.
understand. I will put the Lacanian hammer down, and I will say that the totalizing beauty of experience of being human is precisely to learn how to linger. And I think that is one of the main. If there's a book if there's a book you should read, it's called "It Is the Scent of Time" by Byung-Chul Han. And I think that, and I could get into so many different things now, and I just want to talk to you about Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, but I won't because that will take another 45 minutes. But take the time to pause, I think would be my biggest advice. Take the time to be doing nothing. And that's when the purest form of yourself will emerge in those moments. Take the time to do nothing. The worst advice of all for a productive society. Take the time to do nothing is probably what I would say. And in that, you will get a clearer picture of what you are in a non-Lacanian sense. Yes.
I like it.
Yeah.
What do you think? Good way to finish?
Great way to finish.
Awesome. Fucking
Better
all,
than me,
dude.
better than me calling myself a pervert, that's for sure.
Well, hey, listen, I got about 4 or 5 clips I got to throw up at the
No,
beginning of
no, no,
that.
no, no, no. Keep it. It's quite funny.
It's great. No, fucking dude, this is, I mean, it was fun. I mean, you're so much deeper. You just know way more about um
It's a
kind of the
rabbit
ins and
hole.
outs.
Yeah,
Yeah, you've
yeah,
gone just down the rabbit hole, which is, cool. And I'm glad you've done it.
yeah,
I can
yeah,
talk to you and not have to do it myself. Or, I can peep
yeah,
in because, I got
yeah,
other rabbit holes to go down.
yeah,
And
yeah.
ones to climb out from.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, I would love, if you want to do another episode in the future about something similar to we talked about, or ideology, or, I would love to talk about capitalism as well. I would love to like talk about that as well. We could do another episode. I'd be more than down. If
yeah,
you want me to,
completely.
maybe the people will be so disgusted by me. This might be your worst podcast. So,
No, I think it'll be great. No, I think it'll be great. I mean, I try to talk to fucking people from everywhere because I don't really have a thesis with the podcast because the podcast
uh-huh.
is it's
It's
part of
oh,
me
it's open dialogue space. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
completely. It's an open dialogue space for anyone that I think is interesting or ideas worth sharing. Not to steal Ted's line, but I was talking to a Sri Lankan psychotherapist who was
Yeah,
one of the first guys to bring PTSD, as a concept to Sri Lanka. I was just like, that's fucking
yeah.
interesting. Like no one
Yeah,
talks about that.
I listened to that episode. It was quite good actually.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was an
yeah.
interesting guy. Because I don't know what to do with my life and how to find meaning or any of those kind of things. So I'm kind of just using this as a puzzle piece.
Mhm.
That's why I, it's kind of overlapping framing. I mean, I need to think back to Lacan because that's someone I've never even heard of before. I've never even
Yeah,
heard of
yeah.
Lacan, and
I'm
as someone
sorry.
that's like a
I'm sorry. I have ruined your life now because you start reading Lacan, you'll be very, yeah. You will change
but
the way that you think about things.
but like that idea of like the imaginary other and the real. I'm sure I could relate them to other concepts that I know better because they
Uh-huh. Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
familiar. But I think sometimes there's like a lot of different ways to describe a similar thing or the same thing, and that
Hmm.
the more ways I hear of how to describe the same thing, the better I understand it.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so definitely, I mean, fucking, I
Yeah.
enjoyed the conversation a lot.
I loved it. It was great. It was great fun. I would
And
be
so this is, are you doing, when you say you have 500 people attending, is this in person or online or?
in person, in person, in person, in person.
Wow.
It's growing in London. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, and how do you do it? Are you charging, charging
Right
for
now, it's still
admission or
free.
how are you renting the places out?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like we're renting out different rooms. Yeah, precisely.
That's
Like for
pretty
reading
sweet.
things like that. Yeah.
That's pretty sweet. That's awesome. You know, it's cool that many people are, interested in these things.
Mm-hmm, hmm. Yeah.
It also feels like there's kind of a big divide between like the people that are happily or unhappily, I don't know what they are, participating in this world of as you were describing, Instagram stories, et cetera, and then people that are just like completely on the opposite spectrum. I kind of want to bounce back and forth a little bit. I don't know if there's a happy medium between like participating in society and participating in the
Oh,
illusion and not
you can participate in it, but you don't necessarily have to sort of, you can participate.
100% fall into it.
You can participate with awareness. I think
Yeah,
that's the beautiful part of it. You can recognize the immense power and possibility of social media and also the incredible detriment that it can cause to yourself, right? So,
completely. I like that. Like living it with awareness. Because I was talking with my friend who I haven't seen in a while, and both of our parents are successful, but in very unconventional ways, like not like the stereotypical kind of like banker route. And we were just talking about how that is the ideal of everyone, and we were just like, yeah, but is that like really what you should be going after? Is that the thing you
mhm.
should be chasing? And we were kind of came to a similar conclusion. Like you can do the thing without being the thing. You can have some detachment from it. You can have some
Yeah.
awareness of it, from it and of it.
The best, the
So
best, the best you can do is to find the thing and to be in the thing that you generally enjoy being in it, and it brings you positive outlook in your life. You know what I mean? So that's the most
completely,
important. Yeah.
yeah, sweet. All right, let's
Yeah.
call it.
All right. If you ever want to chat again about something else, be more than happy to.
Yeah, nice talking to you, man.
Just like
That was
the same.
sweet.
We'll keep in touch. I'll send
Yeah,
you
well,
some cool meetings that I do.
fuck yeah. I'll subscribe to the. I just signed up for Substack. I don't know why I haven't signed up before.
Ah, amazing.
Um,
Yeah,
and so
that platform's also turning to shit. So
I was
we might have to cause a
I was gonna say you should like your essays, you should just read them and just have like a video of you reading them and put them on YouTube. I don't know if you do or not.
yeah. Now to the institute, we're gonna start to do it. Yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah,
should. I think there's definitely a
uh,
big audience out there that would benefit from it.
yeah. Maybe we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see.
But all right, man. Lovely.
Cool.
Good
Nice talking
chat.
to you.
Great chat. No, man.
Cheers.
Great chat. Bye.
Talk soon.